Myths may disguise historical reality. If we search carefully through them, we can find nuggets of history. This is one approach. And how can we validate our guesses about history? Through archaeology. So here we have the interplay of the mythological material and the archaeological material. For example, there's the great epic of Gilgamesh. Well, that's not exactly a history of Gilgamesh. It's Gilgamesh as a figure who's a combination of the human and the divine. The beginning of the epic tells us that. So someone who's interested in only the strict historical record would say, well, this isn't of any value. But only one aspect of Gilgamesh is found in the epic. There's also historical material about Gilgamesh. Archaeologists have found material that tells us that there was a real Gilgamesh who ruled between 2700 and 2600 BC. Not that he ruled for 100 years, but he ruled in that period. So there's the interplay, again, between archaeology and mythology. So we've spoken about myth as ancient science, myth as a form of history, and third, an approach which we call myth and ritual, an approach which links religious practice and sacred narrative. One expression of this is that in ritual, humans worship the divine. In myth, they express their ideas about the divine and about the world. And this combination of myth and ritual ensures a cosmic harmony. We'll be seeing a number of examples of this. The most explicit example that I'll be offering in our series is the Hittite myth of the god Telepinu, the god of fertility. This god, at times, disappears from the earth, and that explains why there's crop failure and why people starve. Well, he needs to be brought back to earth. How can one bring him back? By reciting a ritual in which you tell the story of how he got lost and how he was found. So the ritual has the effect of bringing back the god, and therefore bringing back the crops and bringing back prosperity. This cosmic harmony, again a modern term to describe the myth and ritual approach and its efficacy, was the basis of life as the ancients understood it. If myth or ritual were disrupted, life itself would be disrupted. Now, the myth and ritual approach also has an interesting intellectual place in 20th century history because it's also an approach to literature. And it's associated with the names of the anthropologists Sir James Frazer of the Golden Bough and of the great Cambridge anthropologist Joan Harrison. The myth and ritual approach says that texts which were for a very long time considered purely literary, such as the Greek dramas or parts of the Hebrew Bible, really had a ritual function in their societies. This myth and ritual approach was combined with a Freudian approach and was very important in the scholarly world of the first half of the 20th century. And speaking of the Freudian approach, we move to our fourth category, that myths embody psychological and spiritual truths. So I mentioned this common notion that myth and truth are opposites, but in the psychological approach, myth is a form of truth, but a psychological form of truth. And the approach focuses on the notion that there are universal themes in all mythologies. We can find commonality in all mythologies, and that this commonality tells us something about human psychology. It sees structural affinities between myths and links them to human perception. So in this approach, we could look at creation myths in many societies, both within the ancient Near East and without. And one observation many scholars make is that many of these creation myths involve separation. Separation of the heavens and the earth. Separation of the waters below and the waters above, separation of the old gods and the new gods, etc. When humans are created, separation of man from woman. Yes, this is a theme that seems to run through creation myths. Does it run through all? Does it tell us something about the human psyche? These are arguable, but these attitudes are inherent in the psychological approach to myth. I mentioned Freud, who was fascinated by myth and wrote about it quite extensively. Today, the psychological approach to myth is identified with Freud's student and associate, Carl Jung, and he understood that there's a connection between the fantasy and dream life of people of our own time and the myths of ancient times. He saw similarities, both in terms of structure and content.